you to all of the panelists for joining, as well as the audience. It's not always easy to do some of these Zoom conversations. We'll try and give you an insightful conversation, hopefully. It's a bit of a refrain in journalism that you don't really need a degree to do it, that you can sort of just jump into the job and get going. But Indian journalism and journalism all over the world sometimes takes it too far in the other direction. We often offer very little in terms of training, in terms of advice or collaboration or networking to our journalists, expecting people to just pick it up on the job. This is, I think, a particularly acute problem in India, where we often put young folks in leadership positions. We often don't think of it as management or in terms of actually having to run a team. And the pandemic has, of course, made all of this much harder, where earlier you might have been able to pick up some of these things just by being around fellow journalists, either in a newsroom or out in the field. You no longer have the opportunity to just soak in that culture, get a sense of how other people deal with it, because you're dealing with Zoom. Work is much more transactional, and even the idea of skilling can sometimes seem too much. Newsroom leaders rarely think about it, at least at large. And so it's an issue that we all have to deal with, particularly with the media going through as much of a crisis as the economy is going through. We have a panel today of people who have all thought about this issue, whether specific to journalism or beyond it, the idea of making sure that people have a sense of what they're dealing with as journalists, how to scale up, how to collaborate, how to network, how to improve training within newsrooms. Folks here have dealt with this from many different angles, and we'll try and cover some of those over the course of this 15 minutes. A couple of housekeeping things at the start. It's a bit hard to have organic conversations on Zoom, so I'll try and direct questions to you guys individually, but if anyone wants to, speak up, find a way to, a hand up or just letting me know, and I'd be happy to have something for an organic conversation. The flip side of that is that I don't have the Oscar music band, but I might have to interrupt you just to keep us on time. And finally, just to the audience, you guys can put in questions, of course, at any point. But if there's someone particular that you'd like to direct it to, please do tell us who you're asking the question to. All right, I think I'd like to start first with Ritu. The Quint is a young, dynamic news organization that is all digital, so it hasn't had to deal with moving from a legacy operation into the digital space. But that also means it's had to constantly experiment and innovate and try different things, because it doesn't just work in one medium, it works across very different kinds of formats. I think my initial question here is, how did you think about upskilling, about training, even before the pandemic, and how do you think that is now changing for you as a leader in the newsroom?
From inception, we decided that we're going to be innovative, which is why we even set up what we call the lab at the Quint, so that there's somebody keeping track of every new tool, preferably free, that makes every individual in the newsroom as self-sufficient in any interactive multimedia ways of doing it. So that was culturally how we were set up. But equally, culturally, we were set up to be a very, sort of packed together, noisy, chaotic, dynamic newsroom. So while the first thing has proved to be an advantage to us, because everyone over the last 5 years of our existence knows how to edit while on a mobile phone. Everyone's been, our field crews are an army of one. One person goes out equipped with everything. We have, shooting units which are completely meant for one person's use. We had found ways around bandwidth and other issues over the time. So those were not such issues for us when the pandemic hit. What has been an issue is the cultural not being a noisy, chaotic newsroom anymore. I think that has been a strain. We all know, day-long Zooms, which is what we'll end up doing, starts with a morning edit meeting at 8:30, quarter to 9. So I think that's been a bit of a strain. But I think by being digital first, by being frugal and innovative to begin with, I think that's we didn't plan for a pandemic, obviously, but I think it's been useful to answer your question. I think I think the advantage, and if you want, I can come back to it later. I mean, I've got a whole bunch of silver linings to what's happened, but Rohan, I'll let you go to other people, and but I would like to touch upon that for a bit.
I mean, we can dig in just very quickly here. I mean, one, into those silver linings, but also I'm curious whether, as you think about these silver linings or things that have changed, whether it has played out differently for, say, your desk folks versus the reporters, whether it's gendered. Are there, tell us a little bit about the silver linings, but also maybe how it's played out differently.
The silver lining is that we are a far more distributed newsroom. We were all clustered in Delhi, Mumbai, a little bit in Chennai, Kolkata, and Bangalore. But now, once the pandemic hit, we encouraged everyone to go home. We, in terms of support, we provided everybody with equipment, UPSs, funds for whatever bandwidth was available in their area. But because we had trained everybody, we've always had rolling training workshops. That's been part of our culture. The advantage is that we're now being able to get deeper ground reports from deeper into the country. We're no longer clustered in Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore. So the quality of the diversity of reporting, that's been a real silver lining. The other silver lining is that people have on their own discovered more and more tools which are lighter on data, because not everybody, if somebody is in an area which is 200 kilometers out of Kolkata, they're really struggling. Our chief developer, for instance, is 250 kilometers out of Kolkata, and he's struggling with connectivity. But he's really found a lot of new tools which we would have never made the effort to find out. And he's now, doing quick workshops, Zoom workshops with the rest of the team on the learnings that he has had. So those are some of the distributed newsroom, which we would have never thought of earlier. I think that has been, of course, that also is great, because I think a lot of people are saving on, the rent that they were paying, or, some of the other additional expenses of just having to survive in a big city on their own. And a lot of them are young, I think. So those are the silver linings. If we have the time, Rohan, one of the things that I would like to touch on, unfortunately, the kind of impact I find it has had on some of the young women team members. They are, especially if they're young mothers, it's unfair and it's very tough. I find that they are dealing with way too many additional responsibilities. They don't have the getaway that they had when they were being able to get away to an office space, where they could also share a lot of, they no longer have the creche option. And there's a lot of way too many, socially still the expectation being that if there is a couple staying at home, it will be the woman who will take on more of the domestic chores. I didn't think that will happen to the kind of team members that we had. Unfortunately, that's one of the things that I think we should address and try and find ways out of, because that's one major upskilling that is required to be done, is the gender aspect of upskilling.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. And I think a segue to speak to Anuradha here a little bit, who has had to think about this a lot. The Vedica works very much in thinking through these ideas, not just about how growth happens in a career for young, innovative people, but specifically for women and how they have to deal with a world that isn't always favorable to it. So although this is not specific to journalists, Anuradha, you think there are angles here that newsrooms and leaders in newsrooms need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, thanks, Rohan, and thanks, Ritu. That was a perfect segue. Um, I mean, Vedica is an all-women's management program, and it was born out of the fact that, India has many more educated, bright women who are doing much better over the years. But in the last 10 years, we have lost 10% of the urban educated workforce in terms of women. And it's very counterintuitive. And when you look further, you realize that we are teaching young women how to get jobs. We don't really teach our young women how to keep jobs. And that was really the crux of why Vedica was born. When Shubh and I spoke, I was trying to see what might be the relevance of what we are trying to do at Vedica for journalists in general, but women journalists in particular. And somewhere the belief and why we have this blended curriculum, which has management at its core, but has critical thinking, liberal arts, and communication on the side, is really it's addressing the needs of the 21st century professional. And I think some of those are irrespective of whether they are men or women. In professions which are skill specific, or you could be an accounting person, you could be a journalist, you could be a sports person, you could be whatever, you do something. Your career progression as you go up the ladder has to have a lot more than skills in that main domain. Because running teams, running organizations, setting up organizations, and I mean, this is as true in journalism and media as it is anywhere else in the world, that, you have to just look around you and see that there are very few senior women editors or women who run media organizations, if they're not the owner or, I don't know, whatever, some other combinations, but in general. And our belief is that if you don't have managerial skills, even as you pursue the domain expertise that you have, it becomes very hard for the career progression that you want, which gives you the mandate to run divisions, organizations, teams, etc. I can give you a small personal example. I didn't want to do an MBA because I didn't see myself in the corporate sector. It's a separate matter that I've now been an entrepreneur for a long time, and I run a bunch of organizations. But I had to learn running a P&L the hard way. I used to just assume people are like me and they don't care about designations and they don't care about how much somebody else gets paid. And, you just put people in the right space and expect this organization to run as beautifully as, teams ran when I was 22 or 20. It's not true. So how do you structure a team? How do you put parity into it? I think these are just very basic skills that pretty much anyone who has aspirations for growth that are beyond being an impactful individual needs to have. So I think that bit of relevance, I think, to journalism is irrespective of gender. The gender piece, I would like to bring in the fact that, in addition to understanding management skills, we are very conscious of the fact that while men and women are equal, they're not the same. And I hope one day that similarity will be more than it is today. But we can't wish away years of patriarchy. We have to acknowledge it. And even as we chip away or hammer away at those changes, till such time that we live in a more equal world, we have to learn the skills that allow us to navigate this world better. And so we think there are a bunch of eternal, timeless skills that women need to learn till such time that we are in a less patriarchal or a non-patriarchal world. And these are negotiation, these are assertiveness, these are confidence, the ability to ask, the ability to have difficult conversations, the ability to put yourself somewhere. I get asked about negotiation skills all the time for young women. We come from a culture where all the worth of a woman is putting herself last. When you ask people who's the most trustworthy and dependable person in your life, it's the mother, because she's selfless. It doesn't matter which audience I ask this question. And how do you then expect this woman at 25 or 30 to say, you know what, I come first in my life and I'm going to negotiate really hard for myself? So I think there is mindsets, there is behaviors, and then there is skills. And I think unless we complete that circle, it's going to be very hard for us to be able to make the kind of progress that we hope to see. The third thing, again, is gender neutral or as applicable to men and women. And I think these are things like discipline, attitude, work ethic, energy, grabbing opportunities, sort of looking at what you can put in before sort of talking about what you get out of things. And that's another big part of what we're teaching, because I think these are just very critical skills for anybody to be an ace and desired professional wherever they are. So I'll stop there, Rohan.
Thanks, Anuradha. Actually, I'd like to pivot to Neha, who I think has had to think about many of these questions in very different ways. Neha's an award-winning independent journalist who a lot of her work depends on being out in the field, but also negotiating some of these things in entirely different circumstances, I think. And Neha, I'm curious, both yourself as an independent journalist, and of course we can discuss the gendered aspect as well, but as an independent journalist where your differential is also the lack of a news organization, say, around you, and in the community of independent journalists, are there fresh anxieties that even before access to skilling might have been difficult? Now, even the networking is hard, even the communication, whether it's for young women journalists or young independent journalists in general. Are those anxieties popping up? Is that what you're seeing around you?
Thank you, Rohan, and thank you to Newslaundry for putting together such a great panel. I would like to say that, yes, especially with independent journalists, things have been difficult for many reasons, but particularly because anyway, there was no institutional support, like you said. So during the lockdown also, it was very difficult for journalists, especially independent journalists who did not have press cards or did not have news gathering resources, did not have, say, a taxi or the money to hire a taxi to move around. It was extremely difficult. And also because there has been so much retrenchment in the last 3-4 years in the media, and almost 1,000 journalists have been fired. They have also been added to the pool of these independent journalists, and which is why the need of the hour for anybody wanting to do that is also look at various skills that they can quickly think of that they have to actually get some work. And I'm not even saying journalism, but even just to eke out a livelihood. So which means that they have to quickly figure out how, if they can copy edit, if they can translate, if they can transcribe, stuff like that, if they can write in multiple languages. We've also had situations where we know, like, for example, in Tamil media, we know a couple of people who were fired by that news organization, and they were asked to freelance with the same organization for $250 per piece. So things have been bad that way. But I think what can be done now, firstly, as independent journalists, is that even though mobility is restricted, even though independent journalists do not have that kind of news gathering resources, what people are increasingly thinking, I still can't give you examples because people are still trying all these things. But one thing is, a lot of collaborative journalism is, I can see that already happening. So 2-3 people in various cities thinking to come up with to work on the same project. So if there is something about, say, primary health centers that somebody's trying to work on, they look at, say, five journalists in 5 districts in West UP are looking at primary health centers in that region. So which is why a lot of collaborative journalism projects I can see them in the pipeline. So I think that's going to be a good thing if it happens, because right now, like we saw during COVID also, initially, a lot of reporting was on, like, the national highway, but we did not know what happened to those migrant workers once they reached the villages, right? What happened? What are they doing now? So I think that way it's going to be extremely good if more journalists, and not just independent journalists, but even news organizations can collaborate with each other on projects. And that way a lot of information can come, which is not just mentor-centric, and which is what Ritu was also saying, that now diversity, which always basically helps, and particularly in times where we're living in where media has absolutely no credibility because of all the things that are being covered. So that is something I think really, which is, if it happens, and if we can see some quick examples very soon, it's going to be great. The other thing also for upskilling is that a lot of journalists realize, okay, mobility is restricted, we don't have resources, but let's just focus on the area that we are in. So that way, even in an urban space, there is an urban rich space, There's an urban middle class space and there's an urban poor space. So that way, there is a possibility to look at various kind of various denominators in the society which can be reported on and lead to some kind of authentic information instead of just, because there's also this fatigue, Zoom fatigue. There's also a lot of opinion fatigue that is happening right now. So for that, I think it's been helpful. So lots of people are trying to look at local issues and trying to connect them to say national trends or global trends. So that is something coming in very handy. And because news organizations do want to look at original stories and exclusive stories, that just helping a lot of journalists. And because this is also something in the times where increasingly we are seeing headlines from New York Times or Guardian saying this article was written by a robot. So already there is a lot of automated journalism, robot journalism that's going to happen. So the only skill and the only thing that is going to stay is that you being able to go somewhere and report. So I think that way it's been very helpful. And just one small example about gender. So a very senior woman journalist told me this 2-3 years back when I was ranting that, oh, whatever, there's no money and all of that, I'm a freelancer. But she said that because a lot of women are in the lower rung and the middle rung in the media, what happens is that, and Ritu also told me a good example, I'll remind her of it in a bit. So she said that because a lot of men would graduate to these managerial positions, once they were fired, because they were so far away from the ground realities and they hadn't reported for 10 years, 15 years, they just couldn't go back to doing it or finding any kind of job for themselves. But the women, because they were not ever promoted to these higher positions, they were reporting and they went back and they continued to report. So that way, I think it was kind of an advantage that, I mean, not advantage, but it's helpful that you are continuing, you're always honing your skills as a woman because there is this class ceiling. So, and another example Ritu once told me was, Ritu was at this newspaper publishers conference, and she said that all the owners were men and all the reporters receiving awards were women. So, so that's quite motivating. So I think I'll stop with that. But yes, I think original reporting, collaborative projects, both between individuals and organizations, and looking at and localized reporting also, because if you see globally, all news organizations, whether it's say Africa, whether it's Europe, whether it's Latin America, lots of organizations are again going back to focusing on certain areas and catering to that very part, and that's also helping in building the revenue model.
Thanks. Yeah, that's both of those data points also, of course, very, very interesting. And like Ritu was saying earlier, some of them might be silver linings in a sense. You can't say that we would have wanted, a disease to spread across society, but there are things we can notice that are changing things as well. I'd actually like to pick up on the earlier part of what you're saying about collaboration and bring it to Irene. Some of what, and the Google News Lab does many, many different things, but some of what it does is to try and increase that collaboration, to try and take best practices from one place and make sure they spread amongst others. Irene, are you seeing a change in how this operates now? Are we on the silver lining side that people are actually reaching out to each other more, or are they just inundated? Newsrooms are struggling to deal with everything that's being thrown at them at this point in time?
Thanks so much, Rohan. I think that what I would say is that you certainly see both of what you're saying. Number one, of course, newsrooms are incredibly strapped for resources. We know that the business model has suffered as the global economy has also suffered. And newsrooms are feeling the crunch of not only diminishing resources, but just news all the time, right? And as mentioned by a number of the other panelists earlier, the strains of working remotely, balancing childcare, family duties, and others with a very demanding job is, this is quite possibly one of the most stressful times for journalists ever, but also a moment that is as important as ever, because really the information that people receive is a matter of life and death, when you're talking about a global pandemic. And I think that, what has been very encouraging to me to see is, because I sit in a regional role and I work across the region, is the amount of collaboration. I think that one of the areas where we've seen this more than anywhere else, or I'll say a few trends, right? So even before the pandemic, investigative journalism, cross-border reporting has become a huge trend. And I think that it has benefited, right, in the convergence of large data sets such as the Panama Papers and other global investigations have really brought this at home. I think when you talk about COVID-19 and the pandemic, where we've seen incredible collaboration is in the area of misinformation. The interesting thing about the global pandemic now, COVID-19, is that it's a geopolitical story. It's an economic story. It's a health story. And the misinformation crosses all those boundaries too. It doesn't recognize language or nation state. And so we've seen a number of fact-checking organizations, many from India as well, collaborating across the globe to create a lot of information sharing. And also you hear just informally individual journalists who know fact-checkers in other countries helping to do translations or actually on-the-ground reporting. And so I think that that's a really encouraging sign. And, there are so many areas of journalism where competition is great, right? Because it helps to make everyone better. But there are certain areas where actually collaboration helps everyone to save time. And I think one area we see this in is when you're trying to debunk viral misinformation, right? If a video has been debunked by one organization and you have built trust with that organization, then perhaps you can spend time doing something else, right? And I think that that is a really, really exciting area. And I think that, of course, not traveling, building trust is challenging, and so we can't deny the need for building those connections in person and building that trust among journalists, among organizations. But I think that my hope is that the lesson learned from this pandemic is that this is a way forward, and that we can continue to even when there's a vaccine and everyone is able to travel again, that collaboration will continue for sure. And NewsLab has been very much in the area of trying to support these kinds of collaborations. I would also note that I think we haven't spoken about this, but one of the areas that is an increasing trend around the world is this polarization. And when news organizations and journalists as a vocation come together and kind of collaboratively say in one voice, this is true or this is not true, it helps to counter the easy rhetoric of, oh, well, that's just your opinion, or, oh, that news organization is biased, right? And so I think that, this is a really important trend as we see kind of the other dynamics that we're facing.
Right, yeah, it's true. I mean, of course, the sheer challenge is that the amount of fake news being thrown up at this time is also massive. So as heartening as all of that collaboration has been, the scale of the challenge also seems absolutely massive, which brings me to Shashi. You in some ways have the advantage maybe of getting to look at things from first principles, in the sense that I think a lot of people, and correct me if I'm wrong, who come to ACJ, for example, are dealing with these things for the first time. They're people studying journalism without having necessarily done it before, although some people do go mid-career. But are you thinking of skilling journalists at the very basic level in a different way because of the pandemic, or is it simply an acceleration of what has been towards a digital sense from earlier? Is there something unique in the way you're thinking about how to train young journalists?
Thanks, Rohan. Yes, you're right that what the pandemic has done is accelerate the process of digital journalism, at least as far as the ACJ is concerned. And in fact, the experience after running online classes, this particular year, we've had to start online, and we were despairing about how this might, we were actually feeling our way through it. And the initial response now a month plus, since we've started classes from all faculty members is, surprisingly, that there's greater engagement, more reflexivity, also in terms of the tools of the trade and the tools of journalism, in terms of what we teach, the cutting edge in terms of new media and so on, they're able to assimilate far better. Now, I don't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe after 2 or 3 months, the fatigue might catch up. Maybe this is the first flush. But so this is what it's looking like now. And this is, in fact, a representation, if you like, symbolic of the whole sphere we are talking about, because all said and done, although we've been in this game for maybe nearly 2 decades or a little less, digital media is still evolving, right? It's a relatively new experience. We don't have the benefit of hindsight. We don't have the benefit of distance to see what it's actually doing in the media ecology, as it were. So while, therefore, at the ACJ, our training is about creating what you call complete multimedia, multitasking storytellers, the one-person storyteller that Ritu spoke about, all-inclusive, mobile-first, if you like, approach to content creation, editing, publishing, and so on, and also interactive multimedia storytelling using AR, VR, augmented reality, virtual reality, and so on, and including, all of the stuff that's there. But the big, I think, chunk that's missing, or the thing that we are trying to introduce in a very incremental manner, because it's easy to do it, in a certain way, is to look at is there a paradigm shift in terms of what journalism is because of the technology. Has this technology determined the culture of journalism, or is it redetermining? Is there a need to reimagine, to reinvent what we have understood for decades, for centuries as journalism, even while the cardinal principles and core values might remain the same? And I firmly believe that is so. We haven't really touched that problem yet, or haven't really come to terms with that problem, because in terms of languaging, for instance, I don't think we can bring the print media languaging, the television media languaging into the new media languaging, because there is, on the one hand, an informal languaging that's happening in the social media that we see. The millennial generation is speaking to each other in a different conversational, spoken style, and that's far more communicative. There's what you might call a vulgate, a language kind of template that is being set. How much of that is actually being assimilated into the process, into our practice of journalism? So language is just indicative. So what I think is, Arthur Miller, I think long back when print was still dominant mode of journalism, called the newspaper a nation, in conversation itself, a nation talking to itself. Actually, that's come into its own now. The nation is indeed talking to itself, or the globe is talking to itself. So there is, I think all journalism hereafter has perforce to be social journalism, because the social media, whether we like it or not, is setting the agenda in one form or the other. We know that newsrooms are tracking the social media, and what goes viral there tends to be the headline, or tends to be what you track as well or follow as well, unless, of course, it's disinformation and fake news, one of those rumor mongering stuff. So one has to recognize these changing shifts, and that it's panning out, and that it's being determined. The technology is so accessible, is so autonomous, is so dispersed. The devices are so easy to handle, and dispersed newsrooms are there to stay. And the pandemic has taught us that that's not necessarily a bad thing, that you're able to actually bring in different angles, different viewpoints. Although right now, you're not able to go out into the field, that's certainly a drawback. So, and then there's this whole language part that I spoke about. I just want to touch on the gender piece again. And it's from the ACJ point of view, we've been in this for about 20 years now. And over the last 2 decades, we've always had the preponderant majority of our students has been women. I mean, the ratio is either 70-30, in some years 75-25, or 60-40 at best, the women. So that's very encouraging on the one hand. But when you look at the real practice of the profession out there, as was indicated here, is the glass ceiling therefore shattered? I mean, do women actually, are they there in the decision-making capacities, Ritu and so on, I believe are exceptions rather than the rule. So that's a cause for concern. So there is patriarchy on the one hand, and there is the fact that more and more women are getting into journalism on the other hand. And where is it slipping through the cracks is something that, we need. So there's no real mapping of the media in that sense that's taken place for us to come to a real understanding of what's happening along the way. But I think I'd like to just reiterate the point that therefore we need to look at a new languaging, a new approach, a new reflexivity. That's what I think the new media, all these tools enable, a new reflexivity, a new autonomous, journalistic reflexivity And how do you bring that to bear on the future of how you tell the stories that are important to our times? Misinformation and disinformation are important, are very, very crucial. But we must also recognize, be honest about it, that a good part of that is actually generated by our own fraternity as well. More perhaps from the mainstream media, and particularly television channels. It's very telling that recently when the Supreme Court, kind of ticked off a particular channel for having run a show which is so communal, so blatantly communal. We all know what I'm talking about. The government's plea to the Supreme Court was, why are you looking at the mainstream channels? Look at all these digital channels and what they're doing. Try and wrap their knuckles first. So you know that they're concerned because somewhere the digital channels, the channels, some of which are represented here, including you and Ritu and so on, are getting things right, and that's worrying those who are in power. Therefore, this idea of speaking uncomfortable truth to power is actually, I think, taking place in this space. Collaborative journalism, as Neha mentioned, that's taking place. So those are tremendous values. But I think this will actually consolidate and move into a new level and become, shall we say, a new idiom, only if we are able to look at what is the language, what is the way in which this can be a different, just like print has a language, television has a language, radio has a language. New media, which is multimedia, cannot just be a mix of all of these. So it has to be something which shows which reveals, which expands the horizons of the millennial mind. I think that's my sense of it.
And absolutely, and it's one that is, as you said, it's not only evolving, it's also evolving much faster than those other mediums did. And so it's not something that might be set in stone anytime soon. I would happily talk to each of you guys for another 3 hours, but I think Abhinandan would yell at me if I did so. So I'll jump to the Q&As. I'm getting a few questions in from the audience. I think this one's addressed to everyone, so anyone who'd like to speak up on it. The question is, the pandemic has led to a lot of layoffs. What skills should journalists pick up during this time, and where do they get those skills? Anyone would like to respond to that?
I have a quick philosophical response, if you like.
Sure.
I think that shouldn't be a problem, because I think one of the lessons of the pandemic has been one aspect or one strand of journalism which has been, spoken about and was coming into the forefront, which is called entrepreneurial journalism. I think the pandemic actually now established the fact that, there are students of ours, there are just 3 of them, and they have set up a portal and they're doing wonderful stories, and those stories are competing with some of the established organizations. So there is a David and Goliath kind of play here, which is what the pandemic teaches us, that the Davids can come out there and do their piece. So I think the pandemic in that sense has actually given a fillip to the idea of autonomous entrepreneurial journalism. And perhaps, as Neha said, if you can add collaboration with that, you'll have, of course, each of you need to make your own money. There has to be a profit bottom line. Then I think this whole idea of to see journalism as a job is perhaps something we need to relook at. It's a calling, it's a passion. It's easy to say this, but I think you can actually make a virtue of this necessity, is my sense.
Anyone else with ideas of things that young journalists should be skilling up? Yes, Ritu.
I think it's an opportunity. You see, while digital journalism has been great, we also know what algorithms have done to journalism in terms of the importance of speed or in terms of writing trending keywords. I think right now, a laid off journalism, if you were to look at, as Neha said, more people out there in the field doing freelance journalism. I think if you can upskill, not just with arming yourself with tools which make it much less expensive for you to do the kind of journalism, but because of the fact that I think too much journalism has been about the same stories being told differently, or opinion, as somebody else in this conversation mentioned. If you can now, as an independent journalist, look for stories that nobody else is telling, you will find that at least newsrooms like yours or mine are hungry for those stories and that collaborative work that can be done. But that's you have to, by virtue of being wherever you are, we have, say, a journalist right now working out of a village in Madhya Pradesh, the kind of stories he's being able to get for us, or the kind of local, regional fact-checking from the ground that he's being able to get for us, that's real value journalism. So if people have been moved out of newsrooms, I think there is a potential for a better quality journalism to emerge from that.
Rohan, if I can come in for a second, I just wanted to also say that, this is a little bit of a practical hat, but this is a tough time and, it's completely unplanned. And I think all of us have a calling or something that we believe is our purpose or our passion or what we like to do. But there is also a commitment to, earning a living. And I think the input that I would like to offer is that sometimes it helps to sit back and say, what do I really do well? And where does that skill or strength have applications? And I'll give you an example, whether people are being laid off from media, I think people are being laid off from everywhere. And there is a need for content. Lots of journalists over a period of time move into roles in the corporate world around content creation or communication. There's loads of development sector organizations today, always strapped for resources. Now, it may not be the most lucrative option, but I think that the ability to say, I have a strength that I can package differently to meet needs that can, benefit from my strength. I think that's the other way to think about a strength and then using it in terms of offering that service to lots of other places that need it.
Thanks, Anuradha. Neha, you have something on this?
Just quickly wanted to say that I've been an independent journalist for 8 years now, and saying it from experience that actually what Shashi was also saying, that you have to see journalism as what you want to do, but that is not going to get you money to do what you want to do. So basically, figure out things that you can do which are not in conflict ethically with your journalism. So sometimes taking up corporate assignments are in ethical conflict with what you're doing. But I have seen a lot of independent journalists, and especially in COVID times also, people are somebody who knows Urdu is taking Urdu workshops online and making money, or translating, or transcribing, or copy editing, or just like we were discussing, Anuradha was saying, writing content. So I think there has to be a very clear distinction for anybody wanting to do journalism now as an independent journalist. Figure out how you can make some money for your own livelihood, not even like whatever large amounts of money, but just to sustain yourself, and how to use that money to subsidize your reporting, because even for reporting, there's not enough money for news organizations. Because the times that we are living in, the news organizations that have money will not publish the kind of reporting that we want to see outside. And the ones who want to publish don't have the money. So we have to accept this and then work with it.
Thanks, Neha. I guess I would add maybe a very practical thing that I would suggest to young journalists, particularly if they've been laid off. And of course, this is complex because very, very few news organizations have large budgets for commission pieces at the moment also. But one of the things I would really recommend people thinking through is, I think a lot of journalists do come up with great ideas independently, but aren't always sure how to pitch, and pitch very specifically to a news organization based on what would be useful to that news organization. We frequently get emails where people are, emailing Quint and Scroll and many other places and just copy pasting those, which I understand in terms of not having the time necessarily to do that. But a very practical thing that I would really suggest is learning how to pitch, as much as developing your idea, developing it for news organizations. And I'm happy to, and I know lots of people would be happy to interact on Twitter or Facebook or other places to tell young folks how what is the best way to do that. But the simplest is to look at what a news organization already publishes and take your cues from that. But I really find, as someone who has to read a lot of those emails coming in every day, that it's a simple thing that I would, and there are lots of resources online and thinking through it. And it may not apply to you particularly. I know it's something that organizations are struggling with because they don't have big contributory budgets at the moment. But if you're able to do it well for other news organizations, if you end up in a large news organization, pitching to your own editor or to the audience is the same process ultimately. And so doing that really well, I think, would take you a long way. My other suggestion
is don't pitch on WhatsApp.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. My other suggestion, and I'm going to be a little, I'm not checking in with them, but all of these people here potentially have email addresses, are on Twitter and so on. And I think they'd all be happy to respond to questions as long as they're thought through and not on WhatsApp. As Neha said, when I started in journalism, I gave myself a target of not asking people for jobs, but asking people to tell me how they got to where they did. And just taking that, like cold emailing people and seeing who responded. And I actually found that people are willing to, if your questions are thought through or if you've given them the space and time. So do reach out. Don't be afraid to check with people who you think are doing great work and ask them for help and advice. I think we're coming up on the end. Are there any other thoughts from anyone else on the panel?
Rohan, if I could just make just one point, which is sort of takes us out of the near future of the pandemic and kind of looking forward, just as a final thought is, for young journalists or actually any journalists, if there are other areas that they're interested in developing besides just the core work of being a journalist, certainly tools are valuable and you should do that. I would say areas that are open season, one would be understanding product and user testing. This is something that technology companies have honed and have really gotten to the bottom of understanding how their audience takes technology, uses it, and continues to iterate on that. And I think that this is something that news organizations really need to do to make sure that their content remains relevant, useful, and well consumed, right? And also valuable to the point where people, well consumed, right? And also valuable to the point where people will pay for it. The other thing I would also suggest is, and it's been reflected here, but the importance of management, of learning how to build teams, learning how to work cross-functionally when someone doesn't report to you, but still being able to get them to cooperate with you. These skills are going to be invaluable and absolutely necessary. And the last point I'll make is that I think at this point, back in the day, even when I started as a journalist, you could get away with saying, I'm just a reporter. I don't care about how our company makes money. For those who want to rise and to be in management positions, you should learn about P&L. You need to learn about how to balance a book and also learn about the business side and all the different revenue models that are really coming up in journalism, because I think that those who intend to lead and build the future of journalism are going to, from the editorial side, are going to need to speak the language of the business side to succeed.
I couldn't agree more. I think now it's time for every individual how your journalism is being funded. I think for many reasons, apart from the ones that Irene has raised, I think for many reasons, I think you really need to know how your journalism is funded, because journalism needs funding. It's expensive. And I don't think it'll work out if only 3 people in an organization are worrying about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely. On a lighter note, if I might add, on a lighter note, of course, not in this context, on a lighter note, you really need to check how journalism is being funded for a good section of the mainstream media as well, and by whom.
which I think is a perfect cue to take us to Abhinandan. But before I throw to him, and Abhinandan loves talking about how his journalism is funded, I'd like to thank all of you guys. This has been fascinating, and like I said, we could go on for hours and hours. But here's Abhinandan.
Thank you.